Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to discuss Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper. This is a Liberty Fund book that I've had since my sophomore year of college when I first read this book, and it made a big impact on me. If I can find a copy to an article I wrote about this some years ago, I'll also put a link to that in the description. But I'm going to treat this review the same as I did for Neil Postman's Technopoly. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. That's a book. Technopoly is quite related to what we're talking about here with Leisure. And I'll do the same thing that I did for that review, which is I'm going to read the introduction and I'm going to read chapter 1 to whet your appetite so that you can go and read this book yourself. The complaint is frequently heard that our time has little to boast of in the way of philosophy. Whether this deficiency is due to some ailment of philosophy itself, or to the diversion of able philosophical minds towards other studies, or simply to a shortage of philosophers, is never made clear. These are divisions of the question which are apt to become confused. Certainly, where are the great philosophers, is a rhetorical question often asked by those who pursued their philosophical studies 40 or 50 years ago. Allowing for the possibility that the great figures of our youth have become magnified by the passage of time, and for the probability that most of those who ask the question have not followed modern philosophical developments very closely, there remains some justification of the lament. It may be merely a longing for the appearance of a philosopher, whose writings, lectures, and personality will arouse the imagination as Bergson, for instance, aroused it 40 years ago. But it may be also the expression of a need for philosophy in an older meaning of the word, the need for new authority to express insight and wisdom. To those who pine for philosophy in this ampler sense, logical positivism is the most conspicuous object of censure. Certainly, logical positivism is not a very nourishing diet for more than the small minority which has been conditioned to it. When the time of its exhaustion arrives, it will probably appear, in retrospect, to have been for our age the counterpart of surrealism. For as surrealism seemed to provide a method of producing works of art without imagination, so logical positivism seems to provide a method of philosophizing without insight and wisdom. The attraction which it thus offers to the immature mind may have unfortunate results for some of those who pursue their undergraduate studies under its influence. Yet I believe that in the longer view, logical positivism will have proved of service by explorations of thought which we shall, in future, be unable to ignore. And even if some of its avenues turned out to be blind alleys, it is, after all, worthwhile exploring a blind alley, if only to discover that it is blind. And what is more important for my theme, I believe that the sickness of philosophy, an obscure recognition of which moves those who complain of its decline, has been present too long to be attributable to any particular contemporary school of thought. At the time when I myself was a student of philosophy, I speak of a period some 35 to 40 years ago, the philosopher was beginning to suffer from a feeling of inferiority to the exact scientist. It was felt that the mathematician was the man best qualified to philosophize. Those students of philosophy who had not come to philosophy from mathematics did their best, at least, in the university in which my studies were conducted, to try to become imitation mathematicians, at least to the extent of acquainting themselves with the paraphernalia of symbolic logic. I remember one enthusiastic contemporary who devised the symbolic ethics, for which he had to invent several symbols not found in the Principia Mathematica. Beyond this, some familiarity with contemporary physics and with contemporary biology was also prized. A philosophical argument supported by illustrations from one of these sciences was more respectable than one which lacked them, even if the supporting evidence was sometimes irrelevant. Now I am quite aware that to the philosopher no field of knowledge should come amiss. The ideal philosopher would be at ease with every science, with every branch of art, with every language, and with the whole of human history. Such encyclopedic knowledge might preserve him from excessive awe of those disciplines in which he was untrained, and excessive bias towards those in which he was well exercised. But in an age in which every branch of study becomes more subdivided and specialized, the ideal of omniscience is more and more remote from realization. Yet only omniscience is enough, once the philosopher begins to rely upon science. No one today, I imagine, would follow the example of Bosanquet, who in his logic leant so heavily upon illustrations drawn from Linnaean botany. But while the philosopher's exploitation of science is now likely to meet with severe criticism, we are perhaps too ready to accept the conclusions of the scientist when he philosophizes. One effect of this driving of philosophy towards the condition of the exact sciences was that it produced the illusion of a progress of philosophy, of a kind to which philosophy should not pretend. It turned out philosophical pedagogues ignorant, not merely of history in the general sense, but of the history of philosophy itself. If our attitude towards philosophy is influenced by an admiration for the exact sciences, then the philosophy of the past is something that has been superseded. It is punctuated by individual philosophers, some of whom had moments of understanding, but whose work as a whole comes to be regarded as quaint and primitive. For the philosophy of the present, from this point of view, is altogether better than that of the past, when science was in its infancy, and the philosophy of the future will proceed from the discoveries of our own age. It is true that the history of philosophy is now admitted as a branch of study in itself, and that there are specialists in this subject. But I suspect that in the opinion of a philosopher of the modern school, the historian of philosophy is rather an historian than a philosopher. The root cause of the vagaries of modern philosophy, and perhaps, though I was unconscious of it, the reason for my dissatisfaction with philosophy as a profession, I now believe to lie in the divorce of philosophy from theology. It is very necessary to anticipate the resistance to such an affirmation, a resistance springing from an immediate emotional response, and expressed by saying that any dependence of philosophy upon theology would be a limitation of the freedom of thought of the philosopher. It is necessary to make clear what one means by the necessary relation between philosophy and theology, and the implication in philosophy of some religious faith. This I shall not attempt, because it is done very much better by Joseph Pieper. I desire only to call attention to this central point in his thought. He is himself a Catholic philosopher, grounded on Plato, Aristotle, and the scholastics, and he makes his position quite clear to his readers. But his writings do not constitute a Christian apologetic, that in his view is a task for the theologian. For him, a philosophy related to the theology of some other communion than that of Rome, or to that of some other religion than Christianity, would still be a genuine philosophy. It is significant that he pays a passing word of approval to the existentialism of Sartre, on the ground that he finds in it religious presuppositions, utterly different as they are from those which Dr. Pieper holds himself. The establishment of a right relation between philosophy and theology, which will leave the philosopher quite autonomous in his own area, is, I think, one of the most important lines of investigation which Dr. Pieper has pursued. In a more general way, his influence should be in the direction of restoring philosophy to a place of importance for every educated person who thinks, instead of confining it to esoteric activities which can affect the public only indirectly, insidiously, and often in a distorted form. He restores to their position in philosophy what common sense obstinately tells us ought to be found there: insight and wisdom. By affirming the dependence of philosophy upon revelation, and a proper respect for the wisdom of the ancients, he puts the philosopher himself in a proper relation to other philosophers, dead and living. Two dangers to philosophy are thus averted. One is the conscious or unconscious imitation of exact science, the assumption that philosophers should be organized as teams of workers, like scientists in their laboratories, investigating various parts of a problem which is conceived as soluble, in the same way as a problem in physics. The opposite error is that of an older and more romantic attitude, which produced what I may call the one-man philosophy, that is to say, a worldview which was a projection of the personality of its author, a disguised imposition of his own temperament with all its emotional bias upon the reader. I do not wish to diminish the grandeur or the value of the greatest one-man philosophies. When such a philosophy is done superbly well, as by Spinoza, it retains a permanent importance for humanity. For an acquaintance with Spinoza, and a temporary submission to his influence, is an experience of great value. On the other hand, the colossal and grotesque achievement of Hegel may continue in concealed or derivative forms to exercise a fascination upon many minds. I would mention also the work of such a writer as F. H. Bradley, which owes its persuasiveness to a masterly prose style. The charm of the author's personality stimulates an agreeable state of feeling, and such books will continue to be read as literature, for the enlargement of our experience through a contact with powerful and individual minds. Dr. Pieper also has style. However difficult his thought may sometimes be, his sentences are admirably constructed, his ideas expressed with the maximum clarity, but his mind is submissive to what he believes to be the main tradition of European thought. His originality is subdued and unostentatious. And as he is a philosopher who accepts explicitly a dogmatic theology, his presuppositions are in full view, instead of being, as with some philosophers who profess complete detachment, concealed from both author and reader. The attitude towards philosophy which he maintains, and which distinguishes him from most of our contemporaries, is enough to account for his preference for expression in brief and concentrated essays, rather than in constructions of greater bulk. Of such essays he has already published an impressive list. The two here presented are those which author, translator, and publishers agreed upon as the most suitable introduction to his thought. And that introduction was written by T.S. Eliot. If you're enjoying this, please consider hitting like, subscribe, sharing this content with other people who might be interested. So now I will read from chapter 1 from Dr. Pieper's own work, now that Eliot has introduced him to you. So chapter 1 has two epigraphs. The first is from Plato. But the gods, taking pity on mankind, born to work, laid down the succession of recurring feasts to restore them from their fatigue, and gave them the Muses, and Apollo their leader, and Dionysus as companions in their feasts, so that nourishing themselves in festive companionship with the gods, they should again stand upright and erect. And the second epigraph, have leisure, and know that I am God. Psalm 65:11. Let me begin with an objection of the kind which the scholastics called a videtur quod non. Now of all times in the post-war years is not the time to talk about leisure. We are, after all, busy building our house. Our hands are full and there is work for all, and surely until our task is done and our house is rebuilt, the only thing that matters is to strain every nerve. That is not an objection to be put lightly aside. And yet, whenever our task carries us beyond the maintenance of a bare existence and the satisfaction of our most pressing needs, once we are faced with reorganizing our intellectual and moral and spiritual assets, then, before discussing the problem in detail, a fresh start and new foundations call for a defense of leisure. For assuming all too rashly for the moment that our new house is going to be built in the Western tradition, a thing so arguable that it might almost be said to be the decision which is hanging in the balance, it is essential to begin by reckoning with the fact that one of the foundations of Western culture is leisure. That much, at least, can be learnt from the first chapter of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And even the history of the world attests the fact, for leisure in Greek is schole, and in Latin schola, the English school. The word used to designate the place where we educate and teach is derived from a word which means leisure. School does not, properly speaking, mean school, but leisure. The original conception of leisure, as it arose in the civilized world of Greece, has, however, become unrecognizable in the world of planned diligence and total labor. And in order to gain a clear notion of leisure, we must begin by setting aside the prejudice, our prejudice, that comes from overvaluing the sphere of work. In his well-known study of capitalism, Max Weber quotes the saying that one does not work to live, one lives to work, which nowadays no one has much difficulty in understanding. It expresses the current opinion. We even find some difficulty in grasping that it reverses the order of things and stands them on its head. But what ought we to say to the opposite view, to the view that we work in order to have leisure? We should not hesitate to say that here indeed the world of topsy-turvydom, the world that had been stood on its head, has been clearly expressed. To those who live in a world of nothing but work, Americans, in what we might call the world of total work, it presumably sounds immoral, as though directed at the very foundations of human society. That maxim is not, however, an illustration invented for the sake of clarifying this thesis. It is a quotation from Aristotle, and the fact that it expresses the view of a cool-headed workaday realist, as he is supposed to have been, gives it all the more weight. Literally, the Greek says, we are unleisurely in order to have leisure. To be unleisurely That is the word the Greeks used not only for the daily toil and moil of life, but for ordinary everyday work. Greek only has the negative, a scholia, just as Latin has negotium. The context of Aristotle's words, and his other statement in the Politics, to the effect that leisure is the center point about which everything revolves, seems to indicate that he was saying something almost self-evident, and one can only suppose that the Greeks would not have understood our maxims about work for work's sake at all. On the other hand, it must be evident that we no longer understand their conception of leisure, simply and directly. This is perhaps the point in which to anticipate the objection, what does Aristotle honestly matter to us? We may admire the world of antiquity, but why should we feel under any obligation to it? Among other things, it might be pointed out in reply that the Christian and Western conception of the contemplative life is closely linked to the Aristotelian notion of leisure. It is also to be observed that this is the source of the distinction between the artes liberales and the artes serviles, the liberal arts and servile work. And to the further objection that this distinction only interests historians, one might reply that everyone is familiar with, at any rate, one half of the distinction, from the fact that we still speak of servile work as unsuitable on Sundays and holidays. Though who nowadays stops to think that servile work and liberal arts are twin expressions, and form, one might almost say, the articulation of a joint, so that the one is hardly intelligible without the other. For it is barely possible to think of servile work with any degree of accuracy without delimiting the sense with reference to the liberal arts. All this, and much besides, might be adduced to show that Aristotle is more than a name, though it is true that purely historical considerations are no basis for an obligation. But the immediate purpose was really to make it plain that the value we set on work and on leisure is very far from being the same as that of the Greek and Roman world, or of the Middle Ages for that matter. So very different that the men of the past would have been incapable of understanding the modern conception of work, just as we are unable to understand their notion of leisure, simply and directly, without an effort of thought. The tremendous difference of point of view implied, and our relative ignorance of the notion of leisure, emerge more clearly if we examine the notion of work in its modern form spreading, as it does, to cover and include the whole of human activity and even of human life. For then we shall realize to what an extent we tacitly acknowledge the claims that are made in the name of the worker. Here, and in all that follows, worker must not be taken as defining an occupation, as in statistical works. It is not synonymous with proletarian, although the fact that the words are interchangeable is significant. On the contrary, worker will be used in an anthropological sense. It implies a whole conception of man. Ernst Niekisch was using the word worker in this sense when he spoke of the worker as an imperial figure, and Ernst Jünger uses the same term to outline the ideal image that, according to him, has already begun to mold the man of the future. A new and changing conception of the nature of man, a new and changing conception of the very meaning of human existence, that is what comes to light in the claims expressed in the modern notion of work and worker. These great subterranean changes in our scale of values, and in the meaning of value, are never easy to detect and lay bare, and they can certainly not be seen at a glance. And if we are to succeed in our purpose and uncover this great change, an historical treatment of the subject will be altogether inadequate. It becomes necessary to dig down to the roots of the problem and so base our conclusions on a philosophical and theological conception of man. So, Chapter 1 of Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Dr. Joseph Pieper, with an introduction by T.S. Eliot. I'm going to recommend the Liberty Fund edition, and the link to buy it will be in the description below. That's one of the ways you can support this channel. You can also support us for free by hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with other people who might be interested in genuinely exploring why leisure is an important part of our lives and how leisure is different from the simple term recreation. If you'd like to thank me for this presentation, there are links to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee below. If you'd like to thank me on an ongoing basis, there's links to Patreon and YouTube membership. You'll get early access to videos like this one. You'll have a chance to chat with me behind the scenes. And you'll also get access to videos that I don't release to the general public that are only for my patrons and members. if you'd like to nominate a book for the future, head over to my Amazon wish list that's linked below. You'll see books like these, like this one, but you'll also see books on Palestine. That's for my Palestine bookshelf project. Feel free to navigate over there and check that out. But otherwise, pick from the other books that are not related to that subject and buy it for me, send it my way, and I'll do my best to review it in a timely manner. Until next time, enjoy your reading.